This is Ryan Thomas Neese.
And this is Nicole Neese.
And this is the Closer Podcast. Makes me feel. It's a heck of a turn of phrase.
Sure is.
You were actually the one that wanted to dedicate an episode to talking about this. So maybe say a little bit about what you noticed and why that comes up for you is worth talking about.
Yeah. I think that I really want to talk about it because it's everywhere. It's in all of my sessions. It's in regular conversations. It's in media. It's on television. It's always this makes me feel. It makes me feel. She makes me feel. They make me feel. It's always this outward thing.
So you're experiencing it across, not only do you hear it in client work, but you hear it just in sort of casual conversation. You hear people saying it on TV. Nikki watches a lot of reality TV.
I watch a lot of TV.
It's a problem. It's a little bit of a problem.
I think we're going to have to agree to disagree.
Well, you shut that down awfully quick, which suggests to me you don't really believe you have a leg to stand on.
No, I'm really okay with it, is what it is. I accept the level of television that I watch. Arguably, I would say it has decreased over the years. Certainly was like a friend. I was a latchkey kid, so it was my parent.
TV in general, not just reality TV didn't exist.
No, just TV in general, yes. I think I've died down a little bit on the reality television. But nonetheless, that phraseology is out there. It's all the time. And you actually were the first person who taught me about that when we were first dating. I had never heard it, never thought about it at all.
Do you remember what? I'm sure it came up in the context. Sounds like something that I would bring up in an argument, right?
You make me feel this way. No, I don't remember exactly what the very first time, like why it was brought up, but I do remember the lesson that I learned from it, which was if I'm always saying, this makes me feel, it makes me feel, you make me feel, I am robbing myself of the power, the ownership, the experience of the situation. And that doesn't mean for me that like if I go, hey, you make me feel this way, that I'm wrong somehow. But it was the way that you flipped it for me that got me to think about how much more insight I could have into myself if I were to change that sentence and say, instead of you make me feel, I feel this way when this thing happens because.
Yeah.
Right? And that, I got so much insight into myself because of that.
Yeah, so it's interesting to hear you sort of reflect on it. When you say to me or I say to you, hey, you make me feel really crappy when you say that. You're saying that sort of the lesson you learned is in so doing, I hand over to you all of the power in determining how I feel.
Yes.
And I would say probably you're right. If you say that, it isn't wrong. It's right. Meaning that becomes a truth. That I now hold all of the power for how you feel. And the inverse that you're suggesting is when you say that, I feel very hurt. Right, and you said because, well, you can sort of explain why. But the difference is that I am sort of owning responsibility for the way that I feel.
And if not necessarily solely owning it, sharing in responsibility, as opposed to just saying, like, I have no control over my feelings, how I react to something.
Sort of like, yes, if you do this, it's an inevitability.
Yes.
Yeah.
Whereas, like, I've learned, even through changing that language a little bit, that, oh, I feel this way, and to then extend that because if I can learn the because, at times I can actually recognize I'm feeling some certain way about what you said, not because what you said was really crappy, but because I have a myriad of things happening within me or whatever.
Yeah, it's the idea that you start the sentence with I feel.
Right.
I mean, a lot of times, again, that becomes the emphasis of the conversation.
Right.
So I'm trying to think. I can't think of anything off the top of my head, like a recent snafu between us or something. But it's like,
Well, I have a good one that's not recent, but
Okay.
I actually was talking about this.
probably better if it's not recent.
Yeah.
You might get into it right here. Which would be one way to do it.
I was talking about this in session actually with a client the other day about my own experience of this exact thing.
Okay.
And was saying how in our earlier part of our marriage, you used to say the phrase why. Like, why this? Why that? Why are you doing that? And not even with like a stank on it. Like, you were genuinely curious. What do you do? Like, what is that for? Why do you do that? But because I had a real aversion to being questioned and using why as the way that you do it, I would always react to, I don't know if you remember this, but I would get like butt hurt about it all the time. I'd be like, why are you questioning me
You
all the
being
time?
reactive to things? That sounds really
Yes. Right. So surprised,
unflappable,
so
even keeled.
I am.
Which really is
I am.
how people tend to experience you.
Yes.
Yes. I don't remember this specifically, but okay.
I would say, why are you doing that? Or you would say, why are you doing that? And then I would get hurt about it. As I started to learn that it wasn't anything within the why that you were asking that bugged me, but it was more this unresolved piece in me about being questioned. The more I could get to, oh, this guy is just genuinely curious about me. He wants to know me and love me and make sense out of who I am. He's not asking me that so that he can then reprimand me or tell me that I'm wrong or try to convince me otherwise. I mean, you might try to convince me otherwise if it was off my rocker maybe, but that wasn't often the intent. And so I think that was one of the very first things, using that way of flipping it, that really changed how I started interacting with you, with other people.
But can you say more about that though? Like, why does so again, the thing would be, you're making me feel, fill in the blank.
Right.
And how was it, by the way?
It would be, you would ask me why something and I'd be like, I wouldn't even say it. I would just say, I'd get mad, right? I'd hold it to myself.
Okay, so if you had said it aloud, it would be, you
you're
make
making
me feel mad.
crappy. You're making me mad.
Making me super mad.
Yeah, you're making me mad.
All right, and then by beginning to say instead out loud, when you do that, I feel...
Yeah, I feel mad when you do that because it reminds me of this time in my life where, and then I could kind of...
It reminds you of something historically or family of origin stuff.
Yeah.
Right, and so what's important about that, I think on a practical level, is that, I mean, I can even sort of experience it as you're talking, that when you say, you make me so mad, immediately I sort of in the center of my chest or like in the top of my stomach, I sort of feel like a tightening or an urge to tighten it, almost like I'm being punched in the gut and I'm, hardening my stomach to, steeling my stomach to absorb the impact. So in other words, you make me really does put the other person rather immediately on the defensive. Whereas when you say, when you do that, I feel this way, including whether or not you add the context.
Right.
Context usually comes
later,
eventually, if not immediately. I am like, oh, it feels like data. Like, oh, you are? Okay. And, it might even lead me to say, okay, how come? Like, that doesn't track for me. Like, what's happening for you? And then let alone that you were to trot out, some story of family of origin or otherwise, let alone repetitive, where this has been sort of used as a weapon against you. And it actually gives me a chance to generate compassion.
Yeah.
And, empathy. And you combine those two together in the context of an intimate relationship. And you might even have something like solidarity. Like, oh, I'm with you. That was bullshit that happened to you. I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
But again, if you start the conversation the other way, you just sort of by definition start out with the other person on the defense. And if there's something that I think we do well together that is an outgrowth of the things that we've learned by being therapists, it's that in therapy, it's a conversation. And so you want to engage in a way that does not invoke things you are hoping to avoid. So in other words, if I would like someone to see the new information I have to present to them and to consider it and to minimize the kind of resistance to that, I want to phrase things in a way that invites their participation. But somehow that like all goes out the window in marriage or in casual conversation. And so if nothing else, it's just like really strategic. It's a good way to actually get the response you are looking for.
Right. Yes, exactly. And I think it has so many payouts when you start observing how frequently you use that phrase and how many times you're sort of offering something outside of you to take responsibility. And if you start changing it and going, oh, I feel this way when this thing happens, you start going, oh, I think I have a little bit more power, awareness, control, all in the good senses of those words.
Right.
When you start being more intentional. And so speaking to what you're saying is, if I come in and say, I feel this way when this thing happens, and you don't go immediately to defense, we can get much farther into the conversation about the very thing we're talking about, as opposed to often when you go into defense, not you, but everyone, right? You start moving away from the original offense and start talking about 17 other things.
Right. Yeah, which makes me wonder, why do you suppose that people wouldn't do this? Like, let's say that somebody hears what we're saying and they think that necessarily there's something of merit here.
Right.
What would be, explicit or like implicit or maybe conscious or unconscious? Why would people not, for example, want to invoke an actual conversation about something? Why would people implicitly or explicitly default to a way of engaging that sort of doesn't invite the other person in?
The first one that comes to my mind is specifically for me is it's difficult. It's difficult to take the ownership. It's difficult to have to spend the time thinking about it. I don't know how to do that, maybe. And it's just such a natural thing that rolls off the tongue. I mean, if that's the thing that I notice the most, is how easily that phrase just rolls off everyone's tongue. And I don't see it limited to certain types of people or certain areas.
Yeah, that's true.
It is just like embedded, at least in, our culture.
Yeah, it's very projective. It makes everyone else responsible. It's deflective. And you're saying it's simply difficult, both from like a linguistic standpoint that we just tend to communicate that way, and then it's also difficult to pull off. It requires you to think. It requires you to be intentional.
Yes.
And that's making me think, another lesson from therapy is that there's generally two kinds of resistance at a really macro sort of level. There's what's called outcome resistance, and then there's process resistance. And I think process resistance is the one you're talking about,
right.
Which is that like they want the goal, but they don't want to do the work that is required to get to the goal.
Yeah.
And usually you break that down, and there's a bunch of reasons why, and many of them are, around wounds that people have, and, or lack of modeling. I didn't even know this was an option, and now that I do know, it seems very foreign and tedious and difficult. And when you're hurting really bad, none of that is super inviting. And I guess the other one then is outcome resistance, which is like, I may or may not be willing to do some work, but I'm not actually sure I want this.
Right.
So it's like, yeah, I don't know that I want to feel empowered around the dynamics that are going on between us. Because if I'm empowered, while I'm empowered, I'm also empowered to what? Be responsible for myself. And I it's not as easy for me to just blame things on you.
Right.
And the real difficulty, just to get maybe one more layer in with you and me, is that there are things that we do, though, that it's that thing you said before that's interesting about, like, ownership. You're talking about sharing ownership or responsibility for stuff we do.
Yeah.
It's hard because, I can tell you when you do this, I feel this way, it's negative, and the implication is in knowing that now, I'd really like you to consider, is there any way that you can stop doing this really annoying ass thing that you do? You laugh about it, but you know as well as I do, some of the things that we're talking about here are not just like the ha annoying ones.
Yeah.
This is, we've been together
really, truly,
for
deeply annoying ones.
What's that?
The really, truly, deeply annoying ones.
Yeah, well, and what I'm driving at is that annoying doesn't really capture some of them. It's not just like surface level irritation that we deal with as a kind of like, oh, well, that's just who they are. It's like, no, some of the ways that I think couples find one another in such a fashion that if they were trying to choose a person who forces them to grapple with their childhood issues, they could not have chosen better.
Right.
But we don't choose typically so directly, it's unconscious.
Right.
These are really deep, hurtful things sometimes. And I think that I was particularly naive, that I thought that my ability to articulate things meant that you would stop doing them.
Right. Yeah.
But you haven't stopped.
Right? Because it is the thing that you're saying too, the shared responsibility. I even want to, and I know this goes both ways. There are things that do hurt one another. You do stuff, I do stuff that really hurts us and talks to our core wounds. And we would really like to be able to stop doing them, and we try very hard, and sometimes we have been able to fine-tune them. But also sometimes they're so ingrained in us as well, it's a difficult process. And so instead of hearing, hey, when you do this thing, you really hurt me. Well, when you say it like that, I go, oh, there's something here because I care about you as my partner that I should be hearing. I want to tend to that. There's also maybe some long-standing history of how it makes you feel, if you were to put it in quotations. You make me feel this way. And then I'm like, no, I don't. But if you go, hey, I felt this way when this thing happened, I go, oh. In the best of times, I go, oh, I'm really sorry. How can I help you? How can I tend to you? And then you can also say, there may not be anything. This just may be something I have to care for myself within, or something along those lines.
Yeah, but that's a tough corner turn for me.
Yeah.
And I mean, it is potentially on the basis of the fact that of what I'm saying here, that I thought, as a person who has spent I think I have a lot of natural ability there, then some of it is I've spent a lot of time and energy trying to become proficient at explaining my interpersonal world. I really thought that you were, that one did, not just you, that right. Like that meant that. And I think that's another, maybe a conversation for another day, but there's certainly a place in long-term relationships for the recognition that sometimes the best we might get is that you can express your regret and say, wow, if it was in me to fix this, I would. But part of the deal is that, this is who you are.
Right.
Recently we were at a wedding for some friends of ours who are very dear to us, and they had asked me to sort of riff on love for 5 or 6 minutes during the ceremony.
Which was
and this
awesome.
is one. What's that?
Which was awesome.
This is one of the things that I brought up. Hey, sometimes you can't package it out like this. Although there are many things in our relationship where Nikki is my corresponding locket piece, the heart broken in half that says BFFs. Like sometimes that fits really well, and we're opposites attract, or we're complementary to one another, but then there are ways in which we are just two distinct, completely whole humans trying to make a life together. And the implication for that I can see very clearly now at, midlife at 45, that I didn't have any idea about, 20 years ago, let alone farther back than that, was that there's nothing to resolve. She just hurt you again, or you just hurt her again. And it's an outgrowth of who you are. And there are some characteristics within you that it's probably a willful rejection of good sense to think that you can really change. You can be aware of them. You can know what to do when you cross over that line on accident again. But to think that you have had the story that you've had, and that you responded to your story the ways that you did, and then that you're going to meet me, and even through as much intentional, deliberate, intelligent, deep conversation as we have, and work and therapy and prayer and advice and reading and deep individual work, and dude, it's still more or less who you are.
Right.
And I think this is a point where a lot of couples are like, I don't know if I signed up for this part. And the truth is, you kind of didn't, because you never considered the question, because you didn't have the data.
Right. But I don't think we would have even got to this place, this understanding, what you were just speaking about, if I was always outwardly projecting, it's always you, right? It's always you that's making me feel that way, not anything that has to do with me. And that's what I mean by that ability to have co-ownership sometimes. And that doesn't mean that the action itself may more fall at the other partner's feet, but your response is something for you to look at and is something to learn from. And that's not saying, oh, it's your fault that they did that necessarily, but it is, oh, what's happening for me here when this thing happened? How am I feeling? What can we get to? And if you are trying to work through a difficult problem, being able to ask that of yourself is a key component to the entire thing. If you can't ask that, and it's always someone to blame, it's always that thing is wrong, you're going to come back to the same spot over and over and over again, just in different
maybe it's
ways.
that by asking that question, that when you end up at the milestone that I'm talking about, where it dawns on you, this is who they are, this is who I am, because you're interpersonally aware. Maybe part of the deal is that it allows you to begin to say, okay, well, how would I like to respond? How would I like to carry this? That's a turn of phrase that I use a lot for myself, which is okay, this appears to be true. How would I like to carry that truth? Would I like to carry it in a way that leads to argument and division? Would I like to carry it in a way that allows me some space to grieve and to say, wow, I really want this in my relationship, but it doesn't seem to be in the cards. But if I never get to consider how I would like to respond because I'm too busy pointing out that you are at fault,
right?
Maybe we never get to it that way. And back to my earlier question, maybe that's the point.
Right.
It would be unconscious. People wouldn't know that you're doing that. But the point is, I don't ever want to have to be faced with the fact that this could just be a reality between us. And that ultimately, if I'm not responsible for anything else, I'm responsible for deciding how I would like to carry this, how I would like to respond.
Yeah.
And I do get it. Makes me feel versus I feel this way when you allows this further conversation. For real, I understand why some people don't have any ambition toward that. Because I do think it's deeper, I do think it's richer, but that's not to say that I always think it's quote-unquote better.
Right.
I mean, sometimes the deeper into things you look, enlightenment's a little overrated at some point. It's I don't know that this is always a thing that we want.
Yeah, I agree. When I say that I notice people say this a lot, and I talk about it a lot with people in therapy, outside of therapy, whatever, it's not because I'm oh, hey, you know what? This is a really easy road to take, and you should switch this. It does come with more responsibility, it is harder. It will be harder. There's no way of avoiding that because you're doing some work instead of just sort of like, for me, floating through life and farming it out and being like, oh yeah, that's why that happened. Again, I don't have to take any ownership or learn anything about myself here. That maybe in the future, if this happens again, I might have a better experience if I was to better understand.
Yes, or not.
Or not, yes.
Yeah, and that again, this is not all roads lead to.
Correct.
It's like, and you can see how easy it is to slip right back into that as almost like a formula.
Yep.
And you're right. That's why I do the same thing. Like in therapy, when I'm presenting an alternative, in the amount of times that I go out of my way to, say to people, hey, I'm not recommending that you do what I'm saying. What I want to do is to talk with you about it. Because for sure, it will cost you something. I mean, one thing that it occurs to me that it costs is there's a death of sorts when you say, oh, like, the way that this person is, or the way that this situation has been, or if you pull the camera lens back even further and you just look at your life. This is, again, what happens for a lot of people around our age. It's what they call a midlife crisis, is when you realize, I blew through my 20s thinking something's going to happen in my 30s, and then I blow through my 30s thinking it's going to happen in my 40s. And you get into your middle 40s, and by that point, enough statistical probabilities begin to play themselves out. If you haven't had some bad shit befall you to this point in this domain, here it comes. If you haven't had a financial problem, if you haven't had a family problem, if you haven't had an employment problem, if you haven't had a reputation problem, you're going to have them, and then you go, oh shit, is this just how it is gonna be? And literally the answer is yes. Yes, that's correct. The way that things have mostly been is how they're going to be, but here's the opportunity itself. How would you like to carry that? Step 0 is usually grief. Oh, I didn't know. And that is the crisis that many people run into in midlife. But the bitch of it is, a lot of people never get out of the crisis point because they have difficulty accepting. And so they go back to, no, it must not be this way. It must just be that I need to swap out jobs, spouses, relationships with my kids, relationships with my friends. And it isn't that many of those things might not be perfectly great moves for you, but that at the end of the day, if it's a thing that's supposed to avoid the reality of life is not perfectly going to remit to my plans for it, probably not going to work.
Yeah. Agreed.
Yeah. So let me ask you this. I keep kind of drawing it back. The conversation is really principally initially about this device that you and I use. And the answer for anyone who's wondering is, yes, we actually do this. I mean, we've been doing it for a long time, so it's not even something we consciously think about now. I don't remember the last time I've heard you say, that makes me feel thing.
Right.
And because we say it so infrequently, it particularly would stand out now. So yes, we do this, but where it's kind of evolved here is that in doing this, it does open the doorway to different, probably arguably maybe deeper, richer conversations. But I feel like I keep saying, yeah, and then sometimes nothing changes anyways. And you're but I haven't heard you. So we'll talk about that a little for you. Let's talk about you and me for a minute. What's your experience of that in sort of running into that wall with me? Do you run into it? What's it like? And is there anything that you can say off the top of your head about what the things are that you run into with me?
Are you talking about the unresolvable?
Yeah, what happens when we run into it? A thing that you've asked me to stop doing, or you've told me, hey, when you do this, I feel crappy. And I'm
thumbs up. Yes. Okay, so let me think about that for a second. Yeah, well, I mean, how does it feel? Well, it doesn't feel great. I'm trying to think of something recently so that I could tap into an exact thing, but much like you're saying, because we don't use that phraseology anymore, and the ways that we do talk about it, there's like a ton of things that I'm sort of feeling and thinking at one time. But if I think about the unresolved issue or the thing that happens over and over again, I
It's
think
hard for you to do, apparently?
it is. It is hard
Why?
for me. I don't know. I think that this is the thing that you and I have also run into before, is the ways in which we interact with those things. Like, how do I continue moving forward knowing that there is an unresolvable issue? And that, yes, sometimes we can tend to it and care for the other one the best that we can, but it's still this unresolvable issue. And my natural way of sort of tending to things that fall into the uncomfortable or painful places is to sort of go, okay, well, this really sucks. I can get angry, I can get sad, and then I sort of just accept it until the next time I hit it again, which is, I think, the fundamental.
Do you accept it, though?
Well, accept it
Or
in
you
that,
just
like,
stop thinking about it?
maybe I do stop thinking
But
about it.
maybe you do. Maybe that
I mean,
is it.
I think there is a level of it to which I accept. There are things that I think across the board, not just with you, but in life in general, that I am like, well, for me to spend a bunch of time thinking about this or being upset about it when I know it's outside of my control, it's not about me, doesn't serve me. So, like, I will give it what I feel is like adequate attention. And sometimes that is not enough. Sometimes it needs to be more. And I think I've learned that through different times that we've interacted with, like, oh, maybe if I sat with this a little bit more and I was maybe more clear about how that feels, or if I gain a new insight about that impact, maybe that information between the two of us helps us take another step forward. But I'm trying to think about, what was it that Boswell used to say to us about, and I think even Robin...
The Boz. Boswell is our longtime couples therapist that we had in St. Louis. Richard Boswell, LCSW.
Amazing.
Look him up.
Yep. Shout out. Well, Robin Williams also talks about it in a much sweeter way in Good Will Hunting, about the peccadillos, right? He talks about them as these sweet little things that you can appreciate, and talk about her farting in her sleep and waking. Right? Yeah. But
I don't think that's that sweet, but yeah.
But Boswell used to talk about the unresolvable issue, right? That there are going to be those things that just cannot be resolved. So you just sort of accept that they're part of the dynamic. That doesn't mean you don't address them when they come up and talk about them so that you can care for your partner. But there are certain things that just will never be resolved.
Yeah, so I guess I'm just asking you.
Yes, I'm trying to get there.
Yeah,
I'm trying to get there. What I'm saying is, the unresolvable issue for me, at times, I can say, this fucking sucks. I'm really hurt by it. I'm mad about it.
Like, whenever I'm angry and I do something in my anger that hurts you, that you've clearly stated to me, hey, this is a boundary I'd like you to not cross.
Yes.
I would like you to not say this again, or I would like you to not do that. Put yourself there for a minute. Like, what's that like for you?
Well, that's when I think and there's a couple of them I can think of that I'm like, oh, there it is again, right? And I have a few, there's like two maybe that stick for me. And when you say them or do them, I am deeply angry and really, really hurt. And I am sort of flabbergasted by the fact that we've had this conversation, and that in our right, caring minds, we understand one another. And then when we're back in the argument, there it is again, right? Or we're in the situation, there it is again. And in the moment, I really don't often have a lot of room for it. It just sort of builds my own anger. And for me, I think that's where I go into shutdown mode. Because I'm now like tapping into something in my emotions that I don't feel safe or like about myself. And it goes back to what we talked about in episode 1, that thing that I lived by. If you don't have anything nice to say, don't say it at all. And so I'll often shut down because I'm like, oh, I'm going to now say a bunch of stuff I might regret. And it's not going to fix the thing. So don't say anything. And then when we do eventually get to it, and I can talk about it and you can talk about it, and apologies are made and understandings are had, and we're like, here it is again, we've just ran around the circle again. That is where I think it just sort of is what it is. Like, I can't do anything now about that beyond we've hashed this thing out. We know this is the unresolvable issue.
But people do metabolize that differently. Some people say there is something you can do about it.
Right.
You can leave.
Yeah.
You can, you can go to therapy about it. Like the two of you are on your own to talk about how, but that's not where you go with it.
Yeah, well, I mean, we do those things. We don't leave, but we go to therapy individually and as a couple. We've done those sorts of things. And part of the unresolvable issue is there isn't a thing that's going to make it, quote unquote, right.
That's the point again, is that it's not really resolvable. And
it is an unresolvable issue that I'm okay with existing between the two of us. I guess maybe leaving is not, it doesn't, like, this isn't the thing, sort of stumbling over it. Like, leaving is not the answer. That's not going to make it better. And it's also not a leaving kind of issue for me. There's so much more in our dynamic, in our relationship, in the ways in which we care for one another that outweighs that. That doesn't mean it doesn't still deeply wound me. But if I think I'm going to go somewhere else and find something different, it might be a different issue, but I'm still going to have that thing with someone else, whatever the thing is with someone else.
I mean, that's a belief.
Right.
That's a narrative.
It is.
So that's what you're sort of saying without saying it, is that what you do is you begin to narrate it in a certain way that is consistent with your beliefs.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And that leads to the outcome that you sort of find a way to metabolize it. You just have, I'm with you though on the point that you have some sort of inbuilt thing. That when it's not working super well for you or us, you just are sort of forgetful in a way that is like, you probably should remember this. And then there are times like this where it probably works in our favor, where it's like, and it's like an intentional forgetfulness, if you will. It's like, well, this does exist between us. This is how I'm going to hold it.
Right.
I don't think I have that.
Yeah. Well, what do you do with it? What do you have? How do you carry it?
I grieve about it. And it gets filtered into like a sort of thread. It becomes a thread that is filtered into my, like, woven into my, like, tapestry of, like, existential, this is what it means to be human. Part of what it means to be human and to be in a long-term relationship, marriage, is that you will encounter ways in which no amount of intention or insight or even like genuine transformation of the self will be sufficient to insulate you from sometimes deep and very specific pain.
Yeah.
And then I sort of hold it in that bag, just like this is what it means to be human bag.
Okay.
And then I kind of deal with it maybe in a more, becomes more aggregate. So in other words, I stop processing the thing
Okay.
and I start processing, what is this life that like many or most humans and animals have a lot of pain. And it sort of allows me to mobilize it a little bit into like away from like Ryan's problem or Nikki and Ryan's problem, or from a problem to like, how do I hold what it means to be alive? And then that leads to a whole bunch of reflections, and and then they're not all great. Sometimes I'm like, well, what the fuck then? What's the point of this? And you have often, and rightly so throughout our relationship, had to point out to me other things that are true. Like at first, and maybe even you were doing this some, but I certainly read it at first as you were trying to talk me out of it.
Right.
And I'm like, no, these things are occurring.
Right.
Like, don't tell me that like it all balances out.
Right.
Right? Because that goes back to the same thing we're saying. It's not really resolvable. Don't tell me that, okay, you gave me 3 kisses, but you also gave me 3 slaps. We're even. And I'm like, no.
Right.
But they do contextualize things. It's like when I remember that this is deeply, like, one thing about being human or about being alive is that there's a certain amount of deep and specific pain that's not resolvable. I can get tunnel vision, and then I think like that's the only thing that's true, or that's the deepest truth about human existence. And even when I start to hear myself say that, I can hear how easily it's easy to debunk. It's like, well, now wait a minute. Look at the rest of your life here. Like,
yeah, but even that is like a story, a narrative you've created for yourself, or like a belief that you live within. Because, I mean, just like you're saying, I could, or someone could come and debunk it. Because there's 17 different ways we could look at it, or more.
okay, and what about that?
Like, well, I'm just saying, much like my own way of tending to it, it could be solely unique to me or to me and a group of people, and the way that you look at it. I mean, when you sit there and keep track of it, or no, you didn't say keep track. You said, what were the words that you just used? A ledger? Did you use the word ledger?
Definitely.
It's probably in the history of you talking about
use
things.
that word. You mean you've kept a ledger about me using the word ledger?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Let me take a look at that.
No. Now I'm losing my track of thought. But there's just, I just think that sort of the way that you approach it, even in how you're discussing it now, and how I've heard you talk about other things in the past, is one way of entering in. And I don't know if it's any better or worse than
Yeah, I don't either.
mine.
Is someone saying that?
No,
are you
no,
hearing
I'm
me
sort
say
of-
that it's better or worse?
No,
or that
I'm
it's
sort
not
of-
a narrative, or that...
No, I'm just processing it out loud.
Oh, okay.
I'm just wondering, like, what happens when I say, okay, this is an unresolvable issue, and I forget about it, or I let it go, or whatever the case may be, until the next time we hit that, and then I'm like, oh, here we are again. And for me, there are certain things that are like within the realm of acceptance, right? Because I'm not saying like I would lay down and like take anything and just be like, well, I'll forget about it and until next time. But the types of unresolvable issues that we have are not the kinds of things for me that I would choose to like leave as an option, or say that means something like a value judgment. Oh, our relationship is crap because these things exist. It's this acceptance of these things existing, never stopping to try and do better, always trying to own, but also not keeping a ledger, not holding
No,
up
I don't
to
agree
it.
with you. That is a ledger. It's just your ledger is
Okay.
all the things that you can accept,
Okay.
and mine is all the ones that I
That you
can't. Like,
cannot.
somebody could argue with that. I don't know.
Okay.
People listening to this might beg to differ with me, but I'm like, I think you're right. I mean, if there is a certain amount of ledger keeping. I just like the ledger is like, oh, there's another thing that doesn't appear to be resolvable, and it's like I to the degree that causes me pain, I put it in this other bag over here. I take the whole ledger and I put it in that bag.
Okay.
Your ledger, it isn't that you aren't aware of them, but you say, I accept them.
Yeah.
And maybe that makes the ledger feel like it disappears, or maybe it does disappear.
I think it temporarily shelves it until
Yeah.
I take cause to look at it again, because I have room potentially for it to change. But like in terms of, I could learn something from that.
Yeah.
So I'm never
you
just
hear
gonna...
it? There it is, though. It just must be a core difference between us, because you kind of keep going back to it could change, and I'm like, isn't this conversation about things that don't change?
No, not the unresolvable issue, but my own attitude towards the unresolvable issue.
Yeah, your own orientation.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's about how you learn to hold it. Again, that's the orientation. Yeah. I don't know if there's really something. Mostly at this intersection, seems like to me, our basic personalities still kind of do their thing.
Yeah.
And I think maybe this is it right here. It is. This conversation isn't entirely resolvable.
Right. Yeah.
Agreed. We don't exactly know what happens when we get down to that level.
Mm-hmm.
What I just heard you say was that your orientation leads you back to now.
Yeah.
You quote temporarily shelve it, and so that you can do what? Well, so that you can live in the next 24 hours.
Yes.
And it's hard for me to argue with that. I'm not as good at it as you.
Mm.
Because I'm like, yeah, but what's the next 24 hours going to consist of? Because if it's a repeat of that, I'm like not that into that.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's where we have to drop that sucker off.
Yeah. Drop it. Shelve it.
Because if not, you make a mincemeat out of it.
Yeah.
So there you have it, folks. Live and in living color. Us sort of demonstrating both like something that we really, really, yes, we actually do that. We have these sort of intentional like wording in the way that we choose to respond to one another, which is supposed to facilitate like interpersonal ownership or shared ownership and potentially interpersonal insight and change. And then also what we're saying is at the end of the day, some things don't necessarily resolve. And then even in trying to discuss that and to like hear who we are, what we do. It's like when jazz music will sometimes end on like a minor chord and you're like, but is that it? Was that it? Is that the end of the song? Yeah. It's like, yep.
Yep,
That's
it.
the end.
And we're done.